Well, hey everybody, this is Chris Moser from AOPA, and I want to welcome everybody to the virtual Redbird migration. Definitely miss seeing everybody in person this year, but I'm hoping that we can make do and really take advantage of what the virtual has to offer. And so I'm really excited to talk to you guys about whether or not good teaching drives customer satisfaction. So let's go ahead and start the show. All right, so as I mentioned, we're talking about, does good teaching drive customer satisfaction? A little bit about myself before I get started in earnest. My name, again, as I mentioned, is Chris Moser. I'm AOPA's Senior Director for Flight Training Education. I am a CFI and have instructed for almost 20 years now. And I was a school teacher for a long time too. So I was taught in the classroom for about 17 years, teaching high school social studies and all the stuff that goes along with that. And then for a bit there, for about a year or so, I flew freight. So after I instructed full time for several years, I took a job flying freight and then missed teaching, so went back to that. And one of the cool things now is that the position that I now work at AOPA, they were looking for someone who was both a flight instructor and a teacher. And what's cool about this too is that I just recently finished my master's degree with Embry-Riddle, and I got to do it in exactly the combination of these two things. So you're going to see here that's going to be a blend of both the teaching and flight instruction and some research that I've been given the opportunity to do here at AOPA. So let's go and get started. So the goals of today's presentation, where we're talking about this, is that we want to first review an analysis that was done on teaching practices versus customer satisfaction. So that's kind of what I did as part of my research when I was doing my graduate program. And then from that, we're going to talk in more detail about what some of the best practices that were identified in my research were. And then finally, how you could incorporate them into your own instruction or into your flight school itself. And so I'll try to give you some practical tips on how to do that. So the first part is talking about what the research was into, like what was I looking for? And the big thing that I know that you're all familiar with that I really don't necessarily have to tell you all about is that we are in the midst of a pilot shortage. Although certainly right now with everything that's happening with COVID, we know that the airlines aren't hiring, and there's been a pause on all of that. I know that the CFI shortage that we were facing obviously has taken a pause as well, but we all know that aviation is cyclical and it will certainly come back because there is a massive demand for pilots coming that was already happening before COVID and certainly will pick back up again once we get back to normal after we sort of figure out what's going on there. So we know there's a big pilot shortage. I know that some of the research in Boeing was predicting over 117,000 pilots would be needed over the next 20 years. But part of the problem with that too is that the US pilot population has been on a steady decline since the 1970s, something that we're all very familiar with in the flight training industry. And that has been declining since that kind of high in the late 70s, early 80s. And one of the concerns, of course, that we have about this is not just feeding the airlines pilots, but it's also in making sure that general aviation, is a thriving industry as well. And so even just a threat to the private pilot population is a threat to the entire industry because, of course, we all know that airline pilots were private pilots to begin with as well. So we all go through those ratings and certificates. And so it's really critical for us to maintain that. One of the things that we look at too is, well, why was it happening? We all want to know what was going on. Why have we been in this long decline? And some of the research showed that there were several reasons for it happening. One, I know that in the early 2000s, I personally saw it happening where airline pilot pay was dropping. There were high regulatory requirements, and GA was being challenged with high fuel prices, which we certainly all hear about. The fact that owning an aircraft can be expensive, and then the fact that we haven't been seeing, because of that declining pilot population, we haven't been seeing new aircraft being delivered on a really regular basis. And other people in that research too identified things like more complex airspace and the fact that airlines, after deregulation in the 70s and 80s, offered lower ticket prices, so people were choosing to have that option. Currently, which is kind of cool, right now we're seeing more of a bump up in general aviation as people are choosing that route, but we'll have to see how that trend plays out over time. And then the other challenge is that we've got a low completion rate. I'm sure you're all familiar with AOPA that did the study that we did almost back in 2010, and that 80%, I'm sure you've heard this number, that 80% of students who begin flight training drop out before they complete their private pilot certificate. So what we know then is that there is a ready pool of people that are interested in becoming pilots, but they're not completing the training process. And in that research that we did some years back, it focused on, I'm going to focus on there, it identified several aspects of why that happened, but we're going to focus today, and where I chose to focus my research on one major aspect, which was that um, what is a driver of having a positive or negative flight training experience? And the number, sort of the largest one out of the four things that were identified, was educational quality. And that was really a key thing. So if your school's doing a great job, that was made it much more likely that someone would finish their pilot training. And if there were weaknesses in that educational quality, that made it much more likely that people would drop out. So that was a really major factor. And in fact, of those, educational quality was the number one driver. And then coming down from there, pretty close to it, was customer satisfaction or customer service. And then we had two other aspects that weren't quite as powerful, but were important, which was the sense of community, and then also communication with the student. So that said, we in flight instruction have a unique set of challenges that we're facing. So as I mentioned, as you can see on the slide too, we have that low completion rate. Why is that happening? But among CFIs as well, there's something that I know in my own experience as a flight instructor and having been a school teacher as well. I noticed that when I started training brand new instructors, after I'd been instructing a while, there were definitely some trends that I saw that I wanted to dig into a little bit more. And in fact, Jason Blair, who you might be familiar with, in a paper that he wrote, identified that 90% of our flight instructor cadre is turning over every 9 to 10 months. I know from talking to flight schools too that a year, maybe keeping a flight instructor around for a year. Some were even getting to the point, before everything happened here in 2020, that it was maybe 6 months sometimes, because flight instructors were getting their hours and then moving on to the airlines. And that case sets up part of the problem, which is that's a short range for them to learn how to be an instructor. Because I know for me, I mean, I was already a classroom teacher for some 8, 10 years when I started flight instructing. So I kind of had some practice in teaching, and I still had to learn a lot about teaching in an airplane. So when you bring somebody in that has never taught before, and then we give them that instructor training and then put them in an airplane, there's a big learning curve on how to do it. And one of the things that we see in the research is that these folks are new to teaching. They come in, and just as they're starting to get good at it, just as they're starting to build that experience in their bag of tricks, they move on to their airline job. And so it makes it difficult and a challenging aspect. And the other part is coming from the perspective of having been a classroom teacher too, that, and also training flight instructors, that the actual flight training that happens, or the educational training that happens for flight instructors, is somewhat compressed. And so I can testify to the fact that the fundamentals of instruction, the book, the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, does cover pretty much all the major areas that I learned in my teacher training, but they're getting that in a very compressed way. And of course, studying for the FOI test tends to go more towards memorization, is what I observed, rather than really getting an understanding. And I think that's what we typically see in new instructors, is that they are learning through that process of being a new instructor and how to apply the things they learned about more theoretically in the FOI. Um, and so again, we're talking a flight instructor who can get their certificate in somewhere between 2 to about 6 months versus the training that a classroom teacher goes through. So there's just much more compressed, and so they end up learning on the job versus what a typical teacher would do. And even a classroom teacher, their first year teaching is a huge learning experience. So I guess the main point here is that it's compressed training, and they don't get the opportunity of having as much practical experience. And then finally, when they do, they're moving on relatively quickly. And so that's making it a challenge for us to be able to deliver consistent, really high level instruction when we've got people that are still learning how to teach. And that says nothing against new CFIs. Let me just make sure I emphasize that, because I've had some new CFIs that were great, but it's we all know the value of having someone who is really experienced. And so passing on that experience and that knowledge of how to teach is just critical to making the best educational experience we can. So what can we do about that? that's where I wanted to identify, and I started using some of the research that I'd done in my graduate program, and then additionally the experience I've had here at AOPA to start to figure out, well, what are some things, not necessarily the only things, but what are some major things that we might be able to look at to help CFIs get a jump start, to help them bump up to that higher level of experience faster than they might otherwise when they're kind of doing it on their own, which I know happened in my own experience as a flight instructor, sort of learning it on my own, and then luckily having a cadre of instructors around me that I could ask questions of. And so these are the four things that came up in the research that I did. So the project that I did had this basic hypothesis: does the use of best educational practices in flight training contribute or correlate to flight training customer satisfaction? And the reason I went with customer satisfaction was because the database, or the data that I was able to use, comes from our 2019 flight training experience survey, which you might be familiar with if you've been involved in AOPA's flight training experience survey and awards. And so the four things that sort of popped up were the use of a training syllabus, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, pre-lesson preparation, error-based learning, and constructive criticism. So I'd like to do is, I was looking and I compared each of these two. How did it rate as compared to customer satisfaction? Because a satisfied customer will tend to keep coming back and continue their training. So let's talk a little bit about each of those four things in just a bit of detail to make sure that we understand the aspects of that. The first part is the use of a training syllabus. And then actually these two go hand in hand: the use of a training syllabus and then also pre-lesson preparation. Training syllabus, I'm sure you're all familiar with, whether it's like a 141 school where you've got obviously the really structured syllabus and training program, to the kind of things you could use in Part 61 training, which would be like your Sporties, your King Schools type of syllabus, that's pre-done and kind of gives a guideline for what that instructor can do. And when it comes to educational research on these, um, it really turns out that we know traditionally in education that a syllabus is important. I'm sure if you've uh, high school teachers certainly use a syllabus and have a curriculum, the same in college, and a lot of training you might do. And the researchers really did find, a lot of the educational research showed that using a syllabus is really valuable, mainly because it helps to organize the learning experience, both for the instructor delivering it. So there's a systematic approach. I'm sure you all remember the building block approach that the aviation instructor handbook talks about. And then also in the ability for the student to know what's coming and prepare ahead of time. I know my own experience. I During my instrument training, I just had an awful experience where there was no syllabus, and I had an instructor who was throwing, approach plates at me in the airplane and never having explained what they were, and trying to shoot a DME arc, and I didn't know what was going on. It was awful. And I even asked, I'm like, is there a syllabus that I can follow? And he literally took a napkin and wrote down BAI holds and approaches. That's the syllabus that I'm using. And so that didn't help me as a teacher, especially looking at it going like, I want to prepare ahead of time. I'm willing to do that study. So using a syllabus helps to organize that. And the research does show that. And we've seen that in why the FAA obviously promotes a 141 training program, but even in 61, using a methodical structure to deliver that instruction and helping your student prepare and be better prepared to see what is left, what's the big picture, and also better prepare for the upcoming lessons is really important to providing a good educational experience. When it comes to the other part of it, which we know the cost of flight training is something that people will often complain about, a key part here is that maximizing student learning. So really being efficient with what we do and being organized rather than sort of figuring out, well, what are we going to do now? Being organized and letting the student do more preparation at home, knowing what's coming, is a way to save them money as well for the ones that are motivated. We all know that occasionally we come across students that just want everything just delivered to them on the instructor time, and that is their option. But for those that are willing to put that work in at home and be prepared, they're going to be able to save money and be efficient. And I bet a lot of you folks out there have experienced that. Those motivated students, how they can just really just crank through the training because they're spending that time and being motivated to do it. So overall, the educational research definitely showed that providing a vision, showing the big picture, and even reducing anxiety for learning sessions because students could see what was coming and the instructor could prepare not only the student but themselves for delivering that really good instruction and organized instruction helped students overall. And even in training, there hasn't been a lot in the terms of really detailed instruction when it comes to uh, the effectiveness of a syllabus in flight training. And one of the reasons for that is that it's expensive. It's sort of an expensive study to do, and so there's not a large pool that we've been able to systematically pull from. But there have been some studies using PCATDs, and they did find that using a structured syllabus with the PCATD, and you can kind of get an idea of what the um, time frame was back in the late 90s when they did this study, was really key in helping them reduce the amount of time required for training. Additionally, the idea of pre-lesson preparation is for a student that knows what's coming, they can help them with maximize learning sessions by giving them homework that is geared to what it is they're going to study, what it is they're going to be looking at. And so the key part there is providing that structured homework and preparation ahead of time. And that again helps because then the student can study and prepare knowing procedures, whatever the content may be, and they're not spending as much time, they don't have to spend as much time with the instructor who has to provide that initial instruction, but rather can guide and help answer questions. And that's a much more efficient way to do it too. And the student can be ready for what's happening in flight. That way they're not trying to learn procedures on how to do a stall in flight, but rather practicing the things that they've already learned on the ground. Chair flying is a great example of how that can be efficient and better. And one thing to note here too is that while we know a syllabus is important, being too rigid, there was a study that showed too that being too rigid with a syllabus can also hurt as well. So there's an idea that flexibility in the research is important as well. It's important to have structure, but not so rigid that you're in sort of preventing student progress. So being somewhat flexibility. And we see that with experienced instructors. They're able to be a little more flexible with the syllabus and work with that. Two other interesting parts of best practices were error-based learning and constructive criticism. Error-based learning, an experienced instructor can often tell you that they can kind of know when the things that they can let a student do in the airplane, and sometimes it's the only way to teach them. For example, one of the things I know when I'm teaching cross countries is you're constantly trying to drill into the student to make them understand or to get them to follow the practice of thinking ahead of the airplane. What's coming next? What can I do? What's that next what's the next frequency? When do I need to start my descent? I need to get the figure out the ATIS for the airport where I'm going, or the AWAS, whatever it may be. And oftentimes we see pilots that are brand new pilots, or students that get up there and they're in cruise, they're kind of like following their checkpoints, they're doing well, and they kind of get sort of, I like to call it fat, dumb, and happy, just kind of just chilled out, they're relaxed, like things are going really well, and they're not thinking ahead. And so all of a sudden we're coming up on our destination, and all of a sudden immediately they're behind the airplane, even though you may have prompted them, hey, it's time to, what's next, what do you got to get done, what's coming up. And allowing them to make that error, because like usually at first I'm prompting them, but sometimes I find the best thing I can do is just let them get behind the airplane, because just that experience of being behind the airplane and that overwhelming feeling is not something that they enjoy. So if it's something that I've been asking them for several flights to do, just letting that happen to them, usually that solves it, because now they know, oh, I see why you said to get ahead of the airplane. And a lot of times for me, allowing them to make that error and then talking about what happened is a really core way. And there's been research that shows that error-based learning, allowing people to make errors and then talking about that, of course, in a safe way, but talking about that helps, is a really effective teaching strategy, because now you can say, what was the error? What happened? What can we learn from it? But in addition to that, the research shows too that learning how to recover from an error is a critical um, skill for pilots to have. Because think about it, we all make mistakes. We are human. And we know that ADM and all the other things we learn are all about trying to mitigate things that happen. But at the same time, we know we're human, so things are inevitably going to happen. And so in training, if we can show them, look, errors happen, Here's how we try to minimize them. And when they happen, here's how we recover, is really a valuable skill that not only was identified by some of the researchers, but the FAA as well too. They are emphasizing that as well. And in doing that, by showing students that errors are okay, traditionally it's always like you got to do it perfectly. And if you think of sort of old school educational approaches, but now we know that it's actually better to let people make mistakes in a safe manner and then teach them how to recover, while at the same time trying to help them learn how to minimize errors is a really valuable skill and helps them be safer pilots in the long run. And then the last aspect here that I looked at was constructive criticism. And of course, this is feedback. And this is really about how do we best deliver feedback to help the person know where am I and where am I going. And believe it or not, there has been a ton of research into providing feedback and this sort of educational feedback for students among all aspects of education. So when I was looking at this, there were things that were researched into math classes and social studies classes and all kinds. So there's been a lot of educational research into what's good feedback and constructive criticism. And what I found is, not surprisingly, negative feedback, berating somebody, is not effective. Usually that makes people, and I'm sure you won't be surprised, it makes people become unmotivated. They feel like they don't really know what's going on. So we don't want to be negative and derogatory. That is typically not an effective strategy. But something that was kind of surprised me in reading some of the literature, it was that positive feedback just by itself is not necessarily the best way either. So if it's just something like, hey, you did a great job, that was wonderful, and all you do is go over just things that were positive, is not as effective either. It's better than negative, but the most effective thing that we can do, they found, was providing both. It's showing make sure you point out the things that went well, but more importantly, show where are you now? Like, be really specific about, this is the part we're focusing on today, whether it's how you did your steep turns or slow flight or whatever it might be. Focus on what did you do today versus where we need to be. So here are the standards that we're working for. And the critical part, of course, and I'm sure we probably all know this, but it's just good to get it out there, is to make sure we explain what are the steps we now take to get to the next step. How do we improve? And so making that, challenging them with knowing what we have to work on and then how to get to that next step and making that a realistic step, is something that is really powerful in motivating students and helping them develop and progress. So it's that balance of constructive criticism, of both positive and the critical part of saying, here's where we are and here's where we need to work towards a realistic goal. That is incredibly powerful among the research and very common among various studies that I had read when doing this. And another aspect that comes with that is when you can help someone with this kind of ability to assess themselves and add in the part of the error-based learning, when you combine these two things together, it becomes a really powerful tool in helping people become independent learners and being able to do it on their own, which helps them be, over the long run, a safer pilot. And so those are the four aspects. I know some detail there, but I just really wanted to share those with you because I found I spent quite a bit of time reading and researching all these, and these were just four of four educational practices that were found to be really effective. So let's talk about how I analyze this data then. And I won't go into a lot of statistical stuff here. If you're really interested in that, just feel free to contact me. My email will be at the end of the presentation and on the handouts that I've got that I'll provide for you as well. But if you want to see the detailed paper, you're welcome to take a look at it. I'll be glad to share that with you. But here's the basic deal. I was able to take the 2019 Flight Training Experience Survey data that we run here at AOPA. And from, just so you know, that in that, there were 3,788 respondents who reviewed flight schools and how they felt that their school had done. And additionally, we had 3,797 respondents reviewing their flight instructors. So this is a huge sample size. A lot of times when you're looking for research, you're looking for several hundred, 3, 4, 500. We had almost 4,000 on each, which makes this really powerful in its ability to have a really nice sample size of our flight training customers. And what I did was I did a simple regression analysis, if you're familiar with that. Basically, it's I just compared customer satisfaction, which we measured using the Net Promoter Score in our survey, and the 4 selected educational practices. And actually, it was 5 because for using a syllabus, we had assessed both schools and we had assessed flight instructors separately on the use of a syllabus, and then compared that to the customer satisfaction score measured by the Net Promoter Score for either the school or the CFI as appropriate. And so let's find out what happened. To give you, here is the sort of the really shortened down, the slimmed down version of the results that I got. And to give you an idea, if you're not familiar with statistical measures, um, the p-value, which is the first column, you can see each of the ones that are the use of syllabus by schools, by CFIs, and then the other pre-lesson preparation, like the homework and everything, error-based learning and constructive criticism. I measured each of those against that Net Promoter Score. And you'll see in the legend there that a p-value of less than 0.05 is the standard for being statistically significant. So when we're doing research studies and we're trying to find out, does this seem to point towards the right direction? Does this seem to point towards a significant thing? 0.05 is what is considered the sort of the regular standard of level. What you'll see here is that in my results, I was way less than that. So I had a value even far less than 0.05. I had it less than 0.001. And in reality, it was less than 0.001. It was like 0.0000, and it had a whole bunch, like some of them had exponential parts of it. It was so low, that p-value. So that p-value points to it really being a strong significance there when it comes to measuring, does it meet the standard level of a statistical significance? So all 5 of them met that value. And then the R squared, the way to think about that is if you sort of plug in the variable where I put these X's. So in other words, that, for example, use of syllabus by schools, and I have a R squared there of a 0.23. So you could plug it into this sentence and get an idea of what that means. So that use of syllabus by schools explains that 23% of the variance on customer satisfaction. In other words, that when we saw customer satisfaction either being high or low, 23% of that, when measured versus the use of syllabus of schools, could be explained by that one. And as you can see down there too, there's a various R squareds, and the constructive criticism by far was the most powerful one. Over half of the variance in customer satisfaction scores was explained by constructive criticism. You will note that this does not total up to 100 because each of them were measured separately against that. It's just more in the variance of the data, or the sort of the correlation between those data points. So they were each measured in a separate test. They were not measured as a cumulative part here. All right, so what does all that mean? Well, number one, I already mentioned that each of the best practices that I identified there were statistically significant when done with this. One of the reasons that the statistical significance was so powerful too is because I had such a large sample size. That really helped a lot versus when you have a smaller sample size. So that was one of the parts that made this powerful. That we saw from this that clearly, based on the research that had been done before, and now looking at this based on the data in our flight training survey, that organizing instruction, like using a syllabus, really helps students and flight training providers both by organizing that and driving that customer satisfaction. So having organized instruction is something that makes a positive experience. Students become independent and lifelong learners. And so that's that idea where that error-based learning. And so if we follow these practices, we are also driving them towards becoming a pilot that can go out and fly and not just, go out and do a flight, come back and land and sort of go, that was a good flight, but they really can identify errors when they happen, and they can then reflect on those and say to themselves, how could I have done that better? Because I noticed that I did this error here. I noticed that I could have done this better. And then already start to figure out ways that they can improve on that, to improve their ability and skill. And that's really a key thing to make a safe pilot, a lifelong pilot and a lifelong learner. So doing things like the error-based learning and the constructive criticism are ways to do that. And then the last point here, when it came to the major conclusions, was that constructive criticism was by far the strongest result. And so we know that something driving a good customer experience, customer satisfaction, is providing clear path for progress in their flight training, and it also equals more hope and motivation among your students, which then means, of course, happy customers. And also the really important part here is someone who will then continue on and likely be much more likely to finish their training, which is what we all want to make general aviation and flight training in the aviation industry in general stronger. Okay, so what can we do as flight instructors and as school owners? What can we do about this to sort of start to implement some of these strategies in a practical way? And so I've got some tips here, and then I'm going to go into also a kind of a preview of something that we're working on here at AOPA after I do this. So when it comes to a syllabus, one of the things that you can do is use a printed syllabus at a basic thing. You've got Sporties, King Schools, Gleim. I'm sure you can name several other providers. I know Rob Machado's got one too. So a lot of people will provide a printed syllabus that you can follow. So if you're not using one, I highly encourage you to do so. Even if it's one where you're an experienced instructor and you're gonna kind of mold it to the way you like to do it, then try that. Try using that, provide it to your students so they can see what's coming and follow it. And then if you're going to make any changes, be very clear to the student why you're making those changes, and so they can prepare ahead of time, because that really helps them. And then one of the things I'll mention, as I wrote down there, AOPA Flight Training Advantage, which is the program that we're working on here that I'll talk about in detail. We've kind of built that into what we're working on as well. When it comes to pre-lesson preparation, the key thing here is provide homework and provide directed homework on what is happening. So if you know that in the next lesson, hopefully by using the syllabus, you'll know that's coming, is steep turns or slow flights coming up, have them read a good source, whether it's the airplane flying handbook or maybe it's another commercial source that you like to use, like it could be a Jeppesen or Rob Machado or whomever, maybe it's a video from an online or in-person ground school, but have them prepare ahead of time for that lesson, because that will help them be ready. And if you've got an SOP at your school that you like to use, like we do stalls this way, or this is the way that we do steep turns, then give them that so they can be ready. And another key part of that is then standardizing that among your instructors at your school too, so that the customer, the student knows that whenever I go with whatever instructor, either my instructor or if I have to have someone fill in, that we do it a certain way. Our school has a standardized way of doing it. It makes it easier for them to move through those lessons, or in the case of an instructor leaving for the airlines, being prepared for having to switch instructors, which we know happens unfortunately all too often. The For error-based learning, I've got a part at the end. There's a really interesting article in the resources that I'll provide in the handout, and it was written by I'm just blanking on the name right now, but it was written by a person who is a pilot and a psychologist, and she wrote up sort of her own experience with doing self-reflection afterwards, and kind of came up with actually a kind of a cool way of doing that. And so I created, not only I give you the article so you can read it, but I created a sheet that you can use, and I've been using it with my students, where you sit down after the lesson and you write down all the things that you did. And so it could be a safety issue that came up, or it could just be the maneuvers that you went over. So we did steep turns and short field landings and slow flight. And then the student goes and self-grades themselves. So I use a scale of 1 to 5. You could use a 0 to 10, whatever works. But 5 for it was perfect. I killed that. I was just amazing, to a 0 where I didn't even know what was going on. And then you come up with a plan for how to improve that. So even at a 5, even if like it was awesome, how can I maintain that level of performance? Or if it was a 3, well, what can I do to get myself up to a 4 or a 5 the next time? And so they come up with some ideas on whatever they might think of, and then the instructor can work with them, number one, to assess them, to say, well, do I agree? Was it really a 3? And a lot of times we find that a lot of students are harder on themselves than we are. So here's an opportunity to provide some positive feedback. They might say, yeah, my steep turns, I was off by altitude by this much, and I didn't quite keep the bank angle where I should have, and they gave themselves a 3. And you might say, you know what? I agree that you were a little bit off, but it was a huge improvement over what we were doing. So I actually think it was more like a 4. But then together you can work through what can we do to improve that. So it provides a really good mechanism and a way, even a record if you need one, for assessing that lesson and what to do next. And it helps come up with a plan for what the student can do in preparing for their next lesson. So error-based learning, that's one of the things I can't recommend that enough. It really has been a powerful thing that I've used in my own instruction. And if you read that article that's in the resource list that I give you, I think you'll probably think it's kind of cool too. And so it's just more like just get in the habit of doing that. And then finally, constructive criticism. That kind of goes along with that same thing with the error-based learning, that article that I mentioned. But it's to combine these two things together by making sure that we're reading our students and watching, making sure that we want to provide some positive, we want to make sure that we're challenging them, but also learning how to be a good instructor and work on reading their nonverbal cues, even their verbal cues, and kind of monitoring, are they accepting this? Does it seem like they're taking it in? Is it overwhelming for them? Because then sometimes we have to pick out the big things and not worry about every little detail, because we don't want to overwhelm them, but instead give them that clear path towards how to improve. And that's where that article that I mentioned also fits. And just one thing, going back to error-based learning, is that what I already talked about. Allow them to make mistakes. Allow it, as long as it's safe, let the mistakes happen, and then talk about how we can improve it. And one of the things that I will often do, is that I may allow something to happen, and then I'll say, okay, let me have the controls, and that way I can talk to them while they can focus on listening before I give the controls back. So that way, because otherwise they're distracted by flying the airplane. So you can even do little mini debriefs in the air, but to take the controls, because as instructors, oftentimes we can fly and handle everything else and then come back. So I think those are some ways that you can really use to incorporate some of these practices. And like I said, if you're interested in more of the articles, I provided a resource sheet that shows some of these articles that I read in some practical terms. Now, one of the things I did want to mention was that we are here working at AOPA on the flight training team of a new program called AOPA Flight Training Advantage. And what it is, it's an adaptive, um, almost like a syllabus. It's an adaptive training program that lays out all the building blocks that we need, things like learning how to fly straight and level all the way up to cross-country navigation and basic instrument maneuvering, flying under the hood. And we've built it into an approach that breaks away from our standard syllabi that we're also used to, which is, lesson one is this, lesson two is always this, and so on. This one, based on the feedback that you put into the system when you grade the student, if they need review on a certain thing, maybe they're having trouble with steep turns, that will come back again. So they'll review that for the next lesson. But let's say that somehow they are just a master at landing. They just are somehow naturally gifted with just greasing it on. Well, instead of having normal landing or whatever showing up again, then it says, well, you know what? They've already scored a 4 or 5. They're already at ACS level. Then we can move on to something else. Let them move on. Maybe they got normal landings down very quickly. We can just jump them into short field landings and soft field landings, even though it might not normally occur in a standard syllabus that way. So it's kind of our big picture. And if you want to learn more about that, I'll mention where you can find out more in just a bit. But one of the things that I wanted to point out today was just to mention that in there we have some parts that I've been working on with some other instructors to write, which are learning and teaching resources for the students. So we talked about that pre-lesson homework. Well, we've got that built in two formats. One is when you're doing a maneuver, you can see right here, notes to the pilot. It says, here's kind of the major steps that you're going to do, and here are some tips on how to do that are written by experienced instructors. And then for the instructor as well, we've got teaching tips for that as well. So you can see this one is showing power off stalls, and it shows here are the things that you would do, and here are some things that you might commonly see that would help you perhaps teach that to a student. Additionally, in that, we've got homework. So we talked really about how important pre-lesson preparation was in driving that customer satisfaction, and we provide that for you too. And so right now, we've got the FAA handbooks and the ACS all laid out, plus AOPA articles and resources that are laid out. And so now you can see what's coming. So you can see here on the next lesson, it's already saying in the next lesson, you're going to be working on power off stalls, ground reference maneuvers, forward slips, rectangular is more ground reference maneuvers, and then navigation systems. And then on the assigned prep, here are the resources that you should take a look at to go read that'll tell you about it. It's even got the page numbers in the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 6, pages 6 to 8. That's rectangular course. So go check that out and read that before you come if you want to be well prepared. And then we're even working on integrating this with other of the providers that you are probably familiar with. So we are already talking to a number of them, and we've had a lot of interest expressed, and so we're working on some of the details about how to integrate other ground training systems that you may be familiar with that will also integrate into this system as well, so to let you use whatever textbook or training type of thing you would like to use. So really excited about that. So that's an easy way for you to provide that pre-lesson preparation. And then we have the evaluation side of things as well. I mentioned that sheet that I used, sort of an informal way, or actually kind of a formal way of doing that self-assessment. But we've got evaluation happening here where in flight, this is an iPad app. And so the instructor is able to grade in flight. And when you get back on the ground, now we can go through a really organized debrief on exactly what happened, might have some notes on what was going on and how you did. And we can provide that for them. Plus it provides a historical record for the CFI and the student, because when they go back home, they can log in through a web portal and see all their previous lessons and see any notes that were put in there. And now they can really think about, well, how did I do on that and how can I improve? So that's all built in to this system. And then the final part is that when it comes to using a syllabus that we talked about as well, that providing that clear path to completion we know is really important for students to stay motivated and to work on. And we've got that built in as well. We've got two different ways that you can see it. This is one of the ways where you can see all the categories as they're broken down of the ACS. And in this case, takeoffs and landings are all going really well. They're still working on threes are for solo level, and then the 4s and 5s are for sort of check ride level. And so we can see that they need to work a little bit more on the power off approach and landing. If need be, that's more of an optional one. And then a low approach to runway if you want to do that. But all the critical ones are all greened out. And if anything was missing, if they hadn't done it yet, it would show here that it hadn't been completed. And then down below, even the aeronautical experience as they build time and everything else are happening, it's all laid out right here. So just a really easy way for them to be able to always look very transparently and see where am I in my progress and what's coming next. If you are interested in learning more in detail about that app, I want to encourage you to go check out the session by my colleague Pablo Morelia. It's called Flight Training. Is there an app for that? And he's going to go into detail and show a demo of that. And additionally, my colleague here in the flight training team at AOPA, Keith West, is going to do one on for schools on what are your financial statements telling you, and go into a deep dive into analyzing those. So he's got a lot of experience running a flight school, so he's going to share some good tips there. So I just want to encourage you to go check out those sessions as well. Okay, the last bit is when it comes to resources, I provided 3 articles that I found. The links are here. They're also on a handout that will be provided with this presentation. And the first one is that one I talked about where the psychologist had come up with a method for that self-reflection, and then I kind of took it and ran with it. So you'll see there's a handout that I provided, that sheet that I used. And so it's called Take Note, Organize Debriefs, Make Better Pilots. Really a powerful tool. I really found it useful in my own instruction, and I think you might as well. Error-based learning, there's kind of a sort of layman's explanation of error-based learning that I found it was on a LinkedIn article that someone wrote, so I shared that with you, and that's on the handout. And then finally, 20 ways to provide effective feedback for learning. This was actually for classroom teachers, but as flight instructors, we are teachers when it comes down to it. And so there were 20 ways that they talked about providing that good feedback, that constructive criticism that I think you might find useful. And then finally, on the handout too, all the relevant sources that I did during my research project when I was working on this are listed as well. Do be aware that in some cases they are scholarly things, so you may not be able to get into the links, but at least you could try looking up the article. I had access, of course, to them through my graduate school when I was doing that. So if you're interested and you want to get nerdy about that. And there's my email. It's chris.moser@aopa.org. Feel free to email me. I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have, or give me a shout or whatever. And it's like, and if you do email me and you want to set up a call, we could always do that as well. And like I said, too, if you're really interested and you want to get nerdy about the research that I did, I'd be more than happy to share my paper that I did with you, too. But again, it gets into more of the statistical stuff and everything else that, for most folks, probably not as useful. But I think I hopefully brought to you most of the highlights of that research that I did here today. So, okay, just want to thank you guys for joining me today. And I want to thank Redbird for having us as well. And looking forward to hopefully seeing you guys in person next year. But in the meantime, feel free to give me a shout. Thanks a lot.